This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Obesity is a very complicated thing, really. I think willpower is somewhat overrated. And if you look back at the last 60 years, we've not had this collective collapse of willpower. And that kind of brings us onto the GLP-1 drugs. They are quite controversial in some ways, aren't they? Because some people do see them as cheating, whereas for others, they can be very, very beneficial.
Hello and welcome to the first edition of the In Focus Weekend. In Focus Weekend is very different from the regular In Focus episodes that drop every weekday. The Weekender episodes, which are Sundays only, are light, relaxed, pleasant and fun. They are the opposite of the grim and often depressing news headlines we track during the course of the week. More like a breather. So for today, the Hindu's Preeti Zachariah talks to Dr. Jack Mosley, the author of the book Food Noise: How Weight Loss Medications and Smart Nutrition Can Silence Your Cravings. In the episode, he explains the impact of GLP-1 drugs on both the gut and brain and the need for caution in using them. He also answers why it's becoming harder to lose weight and should Ozempic step in where willpower fails. This and a lot more ahead. Over to you, Preeti.
Thank you so much for taking this time out for me.
No worries. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Do you know, I spoke to your dad about 5-6 years back, way back, maybe 2017 or so.
Oh, really? Wow. Okay.
So I'm going to jump in, with your dad. He's always had this really interesting, atypical, attitude towards weight loss, right? He's talking about 800 calories, 5:2, which is a little outside of what you traditionally associate with, weight loss. And you say diet, exercise, so on and so forth. But he always had this really interesting take on it, where he said, like, obesity is a lot more dangerous than some of these things. He even, I think, ingested tapeworms at one time, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little about his legacy and how you're sort of taking it forward.
No, of course. So, like you say, he was this massive self-experimenter, and I think he was this maverick. He would do all these weird and wacky things, like you say. He had 3 tapeworms growing inside him at one point. He had a pet leech. He had televised colonoscopies, and he basically would do anything in the name of science. And I think this is something that he appreciated. Yeah, he studied medicine and then he joined the BBC, and he was always kind of interested in these self-experimenters who would do these weird and wacky things to drive forward science. And I think later on he was just such an inspiration to so many people, whether it was through helping people reverse their type 2 diabetes, encouraging people to lose weight, or even to make 1 or 2 small changes in their habit through his work with just one thing. So he then went to form this dream team with my mum, and I think together they really changed hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of lives all around the world, really, which is quite a remarkable thing.
And how are you taking this forward? Because I know your dad also was interested in GLP-1 drugs. Could you talk a little about that legacy as well?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, my dad and I, we talked about these GLP-1s quite substantially. So I studied medicine as well, and then I did a master's of research in diabetes. So it's an area I'd been really interested in for some time as well. And of course, my dad has been a big influence in that as well. So we had spoken about these weight loss drugs because they were clearly going to make a massive impact on the kind of diet and weight loss world. But we also did discuss some of the risks that were emerging as well. But I think, go forward, obviously, after he did pass away, I did want to continue some of that work forward. So I wanted to continue this kind of Mosley mission. And I obesity. That's been a really important thing to me in the aftermath of his death.
And you've got this very nuanced take on these drugs, right? You're neither looking at it as this magic bullet where, which is just going to make everyone skinny again. And at the other hand, you're also not dissing it, which a lot of the, the hardcore health community often does, right? They always say, just, do these four things, right? Why should I resort to drugs? Whereas you've got this very nuanced look at it, right? That's how your book kind of looks. You look at that side. Because could you talk around about that as well? Because what I really took away from it was the way you framed obesity itself, because very often we see obesity as something which is an outcome of, being lazy or being greedy. Those are those negative narratives in obesity. But here you framed it almost as a disease, which can be, and where you have GLP-1 drugs as part of that toolbox, which can go towards managing this disease. Could you talk a little about that?
Yeah, for sure. So you're completely right in that. I think with the book Food Noise, I tried to provide this kind of balanced view on it. I'm not necessarily for or against the drugs. I was trying to arm people with the information so they could make informed decision. And obesity is a very complicated thing, really. I think willpower is somewhat overrated. And if you look back at the last 60 years, we've not had this collective collapse of willpower. We live in this food environment where we're surrounded by abundance of food, but also we're surrounded by these foods that are designed to be overeaten. They're designed by food scientists to reach that bliss point, these ultra-processed foods. So it's very difficult in today's age to lose weight because these temptations are everywhere, really. And that kind of brings us on to the GLP-1 drugs, which are, you're right, they are quite controversial in some ways, aren't they? Because some people do see them as cheating, whereas for others, they can be very, very beneficial. And what you mentioned earlier, actually, about this kind of tool in the toolbox, these weight loss drugs, that's kind of how I ultimately see them. For some people, they can be a tool in the toolbox to combat obesity, but they shouldn't replace the toolbox altogether. And you still need to do some of that other work as well.
Absolutely. Which is what your book is really about at one level.
Yeah, definitely.
So one of the things which sort of really, again, struck me about this was, the way you sorry, I got that 1 minute, this concept of food noise, right? And how, because of food noise, there's this drastic difference between what food is, the way our food is designed and how we ourselves have evolved over the years. There's that distinct, gap, really, in a way. Could we talk about food noise, how ultra processed foods and this easy abundance, the fact that it's affordable, how that kind of clashes with our essentially, as what we've always been, cavemen, Homo sapiens, Can we talk a little about that and how that's sort of problematic and making the obesity epidemic so much worse?
So, as you mentioned, when we were, for generations, for millennium, we've been eating these nutritious whole foods. And I'll start with this. There's this combination that you see time and time again in processed junk foods, and it's this kind of 2-to-1 carbohydrate or carbohydrate sugar to fat ratio, which is actually the same ratio you see, or a similar ratio as you see in breast milk. And it's something about this ratio that you don't find in many foods at all in nature that seems to send our brain haywire. But on top of that, you have these foods that are being designed in labs or in, even using MRI scanning machines to scan our brains to see which parts of the brain light up when you're eating certain foods. And these foods have not just this perfect combination of, sugar, salt, fats, but also flavorings, emulsifiers, all these other added ingredients. And they just send our primitive Stone Age brains haywire, really. They've actually shown some of these foods as well are addictive, in the way that when you compare eating like a sweet potato or nuts, they aren't addictive in the same way.
So when we come to like GLP-1 drugs, right? How does that help with this food noise? Because I think you've mentioned it as well in your book, and where you talk about controlling the environment rather than actually you're not big, you don't seem to be a big believer in willpower. I think that's at least that came across when I read the book. So could we talk about how these GLP-1 drugs sort of help in maybe to an extent blocking out the food noise if they do that?
I think even the reason food noise has become such a common phrase these days is that it's because of the GLP-1s. So I'll just explain quickly what food noise is. So it's your cravings, it's your internal food monologue. It's that voice that tells you to grab that extra slice of cake or finish that 200-gram bag of crisps or grab that chocolate bar from the petrol station. And like I said, the reason it has become so well known and popularized is that these GLP-1s they're so effective at silencing that food noise. So I'll just quickly talk about how, some of the reasons why we eat. So you've got this kind of hunger. Firstly, you've got a hunger-induced eating. So that's when you haven't eaten for 3 or 4 hours, you're ready for your next meal. So that's kind of that central hunger-induced eating. But the other form of, the other main reason we eat is this reward-based eating. And I think everyone can relate to that. You're not necessarily hungry, but you just want to get that cookie in the back of the cupboard. And these GLP-1s seem very effective at dampening that down. And that's one of the reasons people do lose a lot of weight, because they reduce your appetite and your reward driven eating as well.
But you also said that with GLP-1 drugs, there is the danger of being undernourished in a way, like if you don't get the right micros if you're just choosing. Could you maybe also talk about that disadvantage of these drugs? Like, how does that happen really?
So with the with the advent of this kind of processed foods, a lot of the food manufacturers, they have, they've removed a lot of the nutrients from a lot of these foods and left it quite calorie dense. So that's kind of left us overfed but undernourished. So many people living with obesity actually also have some form of micronutrient deficiency. So the way these weight loss drugs work is, they reduce your appetite or eat less. But if you're eating less of a low quality diet, then, you could be lacking really important nutrients as well.
Coming back to diet, I find it interesting that the sort of diet that you've sort of advocated is the Mediterranean diet, because in today's day and age, one of the things I've noticed is this obsession with protein, right? And the Mediterranean diet sort of focuses on whole grains, on a lot of plants. Even I think Tim Spector, who's, blurbed your book, I mean, I follow his work. I love his work. And he also talks a lot about that sort of food, right? Lentils, your nuts. And in this very protein-centered world, and it has become a very protein-centered world, how does this Mediterranean diet fit in? Why do you think that's better than these high-protein, low-carbs, the high-fat? Why do you think this particular diet works better?
Well, the Mediterranean style of diet it's the most evidence-based dietary pattern in the world. So it has been shown to be not just a diet that's much easier to stick to, which is obviously very important. The low fat or the low carb diets, both of them are actually quite hard to stick to long term, because it is, people do find it enjoyable to follow. It has been associated with better weight loss over the long term than the low fat or the low carb, but not just weight loss. It's also been shown to be massively good for our health overall. So there was a big study that showed it could reduce your risk of heart disease by 30%, your risk of diabetes by 60%, and the risk of breast cancer by almost 70%, which was quite astonishing, really. And I think this is, so it's the Mediterranean style diet is the one that I'm kind of interested in, because it can actually be adapted to other other cultures really. If you don't want to follow that strictly, because it's essentially a diet packed full of, plenty of veggies, fruit, like you said, nuts, seeds, legumes are really important. So things like lentils, chickpeas, some oily fish, and plenty of olive oil as well is the other thing. So it is it's a very good dietary pattern in that it is good for your health, and also it's actually easier to stick to than some of these other ones.
It also very strangely reflects some of the diets seen in the blue zones, like the sort of focus on vegetables. I was just wondering if, that was really just off topic.
Yeah. But I think there's obviously a lot of talk about protein. Obviously I don't, the Mediterranean style diet has plenty of protein, but it's also got these other things like healthy fats, fiber, vitamins, minerals, and also these anti-inflammatory properties in plants called polyphenols. I think the protein, is potentially becoming more important in the sense that if people are on the weight loss medications, one of the concerns is muscle loss, and protein does help reduce that muscle loss over time.
So the thing with the GLP-1 drugs is also, you've sort of said it's like a wild west out there in some ways. There's the lack of sort of standardization in its sales, and how does one combat it? Because right now it seems to be really freely available. Apparently there are instances of microdosing. I mean, how do you set some sort of standards here? Because it's one of those things which feel very unregulated at this point.
Yeah, without a doubt. It is really the Wild West out there, like you say. I don't think people are provided that much info about how they work, their risks and rewards, their side effects and how to manage them. And especially kind of what sort of foods are good to eat on them and what sort of activities are good to do, for instance, even considering some strength training to offset that muscle loss. I think the other problem at the moment is because there's such this massive demand for them, they also remain quite expensive, and there's a lot of sharks and cowboys out there who are providing this fake GLP-1s as well. So you have to be careful. You've got to be careful there too. I think the final thing part of that is, for instance, at least in the UK, you don't need any consultation before you start these weight loss medications. In terms of you can do an online consultation, fill in a few forms. You don't even need a video consultation, which could be beneficial. Because I know one of my concerns about this is that they could be used by people who may be metabolically well, who are of a healthy BMI, who don't fit the criteria for them. And I do have some concerns that for people with, for instance, eating disorders, they could be really, really dangerous.
At least with things like surgery, I think you have to hit that 27 or 28% if I'm not mistaken, right? Bariatric and all of that, you need to have that. And how did this book really come together? Like, what really triggered it for you? I mean, how did that really happen?
Yeah. So I was closely following these GLP-1s, and I was struck by the lack of information kind of provided to people. I think they were seen as this magic fix, as this kind of, this magic fix really. And these are really powerful drugs. And I felt like, people should be well informed about them. So I was speaking to my mum about this, while we were away with my girlfriend in Austria, actually. And I kind of said, oh, why don't I write a book about it? I work I work in a GP surgery as well. So I see a lot of people on these weight loss medications, and as working as a doctor, I can see how valuable it could be to certain people. So the book actually began, as I was kind of sat on the floor of this busy carriage on the way from Austria to Germany with my mum, and we're kind of thinking about some of the chapters. So she ended up, she's a GP, or she used to be a GP as well, and she wrote the 50 recipes in the back of the book.
How did those recipes get curated? I mean, what went into kind of selecting them, and is it because they fit into that Mediterranean style of eating? Like, how did that really come about?
Yeah, so my mum had written, so she used to work as a doctor in the NHS, and yeah, she'd written many books actually with my dad about how, on healthy eating. So she had a lot of experience actually at writing these sorts of books. And she's always written these books in the recipes in a Mediterranean style approach. So, with plenty of protein, healthy fats, fiber, all these kind of nutritious foods, but also made sure that they are, tasty recipes. And I think the final, this is an important bit, is that they are quite simple because, we all do lead these really busy lives. So I think keeping them quite simple is actually quite important to most people.
Going back to these drugs, could we just talk about how they actually work? Like, how do they work in the body?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so these weight loss drugs, so they are the GLP-1 agonists. That's kind of like the class of drug. And these are gut hormones, and they work really on three key areas. They work on multiple organs around the body, but there's three key areas they work on. So firstly, they reduce your blood sugar levels, and this is why they've been used for 20 years to treat type 2 diabetes, long before they were used for weight loss drugs. Secondly, they act on your gut, so they slow your digestive tract down, and this also helps, keep you full for longer because it slows the emptying of your stomach, but it can also lead to side effects if your gut's slowed down too much. And thirdly, and I think this is where they're so interesting and where they have their big effect on weight loss, is they act centrally on the brain. So they reduce our appetite. They act on an area, the hypothalamus, to reduce our appetite, but they also, what I referred to earlier, they act on your reward centers as well. And they seem to help regulate those reward centers to reduce your cravings and your needs to grab that sugar high.
So that's interesting. Can we talk a little bit about that? Because you touched on it a little earlier in our conversation. But this idea of obesity, of reaching out for food, being very linked to the brain and how the brain desires this food, right? Which is a huge part of how we sort of negotiate food itself, right? And especially in this very overcrowded marketplace filled with cheap, really delicious food, like processed food. Could we talk about that? Why managing your headspace is such an important part of a weight loss journey?
Yeah, of course. So I'll just kind of talk a little bit about how we're still not completely clear as to how they regulate our, these reward centers, but they seem to, they seem to dampen down the dopamine rush when you see a food, when you see the sight, the smell, or even the sound of these foods. So you're less interested in grabbing that bag of crisps. And I think on the kind of topic of helping regulate these things, I think things like stress is a massive factor in why we eat. So when you're stressed, again, you don't reach for the broccoli, do you? You reach for that tin of biscuits because you want that sugar high. And that's a very established phenomenon. You get this rush of, you get the rush of cortisol and adrenaline. And especially if you're in a continuous stress state, it can lead to a lot of weight gain. And a lot of that is put on around your middle.
So one of the things which people talk about is cortisol and inflammation, right? I mean, that's all over Instagram, at least. Maybe it just comes because of the algorithm or whatever. But I just see a lot of people saying that, when I worked out 6 days a week, I didn't lose weight. I cut it back. What are your thoughts around inflammation and cortisol? Do these drugs have I mean, any role to play? And like, do they manage that better? Any thoughts around that, or is it not proven? I just wonder.
I think in terms of, yeah, so like you mentioned, cortisol is a massive factor in why people gain weight. And, I think I actually, when I first worked as a junior doctor, I thought I'd been naturally slim a lot of my life, but I managed to put on 15 kilos in the first year as working as a junior doctor. And again, a lot of that was around my middle. I was quite stressed as I found my way in the hospital. I was able to lose that weight again because, I think especially my parents have always taught me, good cooking and that sort of thing. And I just changed little tweaks in my diet. And I can see how easy it is to put on weight, especially when you're stressed. I think with these weight loss medications, they don't appear, it's not clear yet that they affect your cortisol. So what was the other part of that question you said again?
Inflammation. Everyone's talking today about inflammation and weight gain, and I wondered.
Yeah. So inflammation, when you're living with obesity, we know that is quite a pro-inflammatory state, actually. So you have your all these fat cells that do release these chemical messengers that are kind of pro-inflammatory, and that's a part of why a lot of people with living with obesity tend to have all these obesity-related diseases from strokes to heart disease, but even to things like osteoarthritis. I suspect that a large part of their ability to reduce the inflammation, and they do reduce the inflammation in people living with obesity, is their effect on improving your metabolic health. So you lose a lot of the visceral fat around your waist, which again is very pro-inflammatory, and that's the nasty fat that clings to our organs. So I suspect a large part of the improvement is due to, fat loss and the improvement in our metabolic health. But there is some suggestion that there is this additive effect, that they have a kind of anti-inflammatory effect in their own right. The jury's still out, I think, on that part.
Okay. I'd like to talk a little about exercise. I mean, everyone knows that calorie deficit is what you need to look at if you want to lose weight, right? But exercise is what helps you sort of keep it going and keep weight off. How does exercise factor into when I take these drugs, right? Why is it? Can you talk a little about how important exercise is because of the muscle loss, which is going to happen because of these drugs? Because you also talked a little about how body composition changes when you lose weight. You tend to lose muscle as well. And as you know, we also tend to gain back weight. So then when we gain back weight, we tend to gain back fat. So could we talk a little about that as well?
Yeah. So from the age of 30 onwards, actually, as early as 30, we start to lose around 5% of our muscle mass every year, in fact. And this actually accelerates when you reach your 60s, to the point where when you're in your 70s, you may have lost as much as half of your muscle mass. Now, this isn't an inevitable process, but if you do, if you change what you're eating, and especially, like you mentioned, activity, if you're eating lots of protein and not exercising, then it's not going to make a huge difference, to be honest. But if you're eating sufficient protein and doing exercising, so that can be, it depends what your baseline is. If you don't do any exercise, any activity is better than no activity. But especially with these weight loss drugs, it's definitely worth considering some form of strength training, because these weight loss drugs can lead to significant muscle loss if you're not careful, because you severely reduce what you're eating. And I think for some people, strength training could be quite scary. Going to the gym, this is obviously potentially, a new thing for a lot of people, actually. But you can do quite a lot, really, from the comfort of your own home, even, waking up in the morning, doing some body weight squats, doing a few press ups, even starting on your knees, and you can start really gently and kind of build up over time. But it's strength. Having sufficient muscle mass is really important, not just for longevity, but living well into your later ages to reduce frailty and making sure you can enjoy your retirement or living independently in later life. But it's also really important to as a glucose sink, reduce your risk of future diabetes. So I think it is definitely something to consider if you are on these weight loss drugs.
I remember your dad used to do these short little workout press ups, and I think he spoke about sort of like exercise snacking. I remember him saying,
Yeah.
is that enough? Like, is 7 minutes? It's enough.
Yeah. I think, I mean, obviously, you can do as much or as little as you want. And I think my dad was no lover of exercise, but he understood the importance of it. He didn't get the same kind of endorphins that some people who love exercise really get that runner's high, don't they? Or the high when they've done some muscle-based workout. He didn't really get that, but he incorporated it into his routine so it became a habit. So he would do press-ups every morning, squats every morning. And I think that's the way he was able to incorporate that sort of thing into his life and just make it so he didn't even have to think about it and did it first thing in the morning. And like you say, it's almost this exercise snacking. He did it, I think, a 6-minute workout in the morning, and that was sufficient, really.
And what next? Are you working on something else? Is there another book on its way? I mean, what next for you?
I'm just kind of enjoying talking about this book at the moment. There may be another book further down the line, but it'll be in its early stages now, and it's top secret for now. But no, I've been enjoying writing this book, and I'm still working as well as a doctor at the moment. So I still work in a GP surgery 3 days a week, and I'm kind of doing other things on those other days. So I'm enjoying both at the moment.
What do you really want your reader to take away from this book? Like, what do you think is, that kernel, if I want to take away? What do you think it is? What do you want them to really go away with?
What I would want them to take away is that for some people, these weight loss drugs, they're not for everyone, but for some people who have really tried to lose weight and they're really struggling, for some people who are living with obesity, they can be beneficial, but I think they should be used in that case as an opportunity to also change your, lifestyle and eating habits as well. So that is so vital. That's the ultimate takeaway, that they're not a magic fix, but you have to change your diet and lifestyle as well while you're on them. And there can be an opportunity to do that without the pesky food noise, which is obviously the name of the book.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This was great. I'm good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, I've really enjoyed it too.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.